To get this project started, we'll begin by removing the two monocoque halves. Plastric liquid glue will be used to join the two halves together. Notice I'm only gluing part way up, leaving the back part of the monocoque loose so I can add the seat and bulkhead later. A little extra is applied to the inside to make sure I have a good strong bond. While the monocoque dries, I'll begin by assembling the front wing. Again, plastric liquid glue works great on the bare plastic parts. All the body pieces were shot with Tamiya primer first, followed by a white lacquer base coat. Next, the wings were sprayed with a Corvette red automotive base coat. After the red paint had dried for a few hours, I'll get started on the decals by applying the big faded side panels first. Before sliding the decal into place, I wet the body with some water and microset setting solution. I slowly move the decal around with my finger to make sure it's in the right position. Once I'm happy with the location, I'll begin removing the excess water with a soft brush. Getting the decal to conform can be a bit tedious, but it just takes a little bit of time and patience. Using a little bit of the micro set and a wet brush, I slowly work out all the wrinkles and air bubbles. It's important to keep the decal wet and slowly work out all the air bubbles. Again, I'm just pushing from the center of the decal towards the outside to remove any air or water trapped underneath the decal. A sharp hobby blade is used to trim the excess decal around the ridge down the center of the monocoque. One final bit of brushing with some micro set and the decal is just about finished. Here you can see the decal's getting pretty close. It's starting to conform to all the nooks and crannies of the body. While the decal's dry, we can get started on the driver's seat and steering wheel. I painted the seat and seat belts with contrasting shades of black to make them stand out. The hardware on the seat belts were picked out with silver Testors lacquer paint. The decal sheet contains the decals for the steering wheel and the seat belts. Again, some micro setting solution will help these decals conform. The seatbelt decals are added as well. The individual buttons on the steering wheel were picked out with various shades of Tamiya jar paint using a sharp toothpick. A thin strip of carbon fiber decal was applied to the top of the steering wheel. The dash bulkhead also had its buttons picked out with some small dots of paint. These parts are now ready for assembly. Next, I added the oil tank to the back of the rear bulkhead using some Zap-A-Gap superglue. A little Tamiya black panel line wash was added to the top of the oil tank fittings. This just helps bring out some of the molded detail. Once the clear coat was dry, I added some Scale Motorsports 1/12 scale twill weave decals to the sides of the monocoque. You'll also notice I had fogged the front edge of my fade with the airbrush while I still had the red paint in the jar. The area in front of the driver was also masked off and sprayed with some flat black. Next we'll glue in the fuel filler buckeye, followed by the seat, and then finally the rear bulkhead. There's two faint ridges molded to the inside of the monocoque that helps line up the dash when the seat is installed. The back of the seat rests against two molded in notches. Once again, just a little bit of green Zap-A-Gap superglue will hold it in place. And finally, the rear bulkhead is glued into the back of the monocoque. There are several locating pins to ensure its correct alignment. The completed monocoque can now be set aside, and we'll get ready to work on the engine and rear suspension. I pre-painted all of the engine, gearbox, and rear suspension pieces ahead of time. These are all painted with various colors of Tamiya paint, as well as some alclad metallic finishes. The first step is to install the lower rear A-arms to the gearbox. The location is marked on the top of it. Notice there are two holes on the outer edges of the rear A-arms where the push rods will attach. Once in place, we'll add the rear gearbox cover. Then the top of the gearbox can be glued to the lower section, sandwiching the rear A-arms. The one-piece rear push rods and suspension pivots can be added next. Once the glue has dried from the previous steps, we can add the rear dampeners. All it takes is a small dot of green Zap-A-Gap to hold these dampeners in place. The upper rear A-arms were given a coat of Tamiya TS14 black straight from the spray can. The wheels were also painted black at this time as well. Once that had dried, they were followed up with a coat of Revell chrome spray, again sprayed right from the can. The chrome pieces were then set aside for 24 hours to fully dry. You'll notice I try and handle the chrome as little as possible. An important note about this kit is anytime there are parts on the left side and right side that look similar, they are given different part numbers. All the parts on the left side will have odd part numbers, all the parts on the right side will have even part numbers. So if you ever get confused, it's easy to know which side they should go on. On the rear suspension arms, you should notice that the back edge is completely flat, whereas the front edge has a slight bit of curve to it. This will help you make sure you get them in the right location. Again, make sure you're putting the odd part numbers on the left side, even part numbers on the right side. Then these are glued into the gearbox using green Zap-A-Gap. Again, you'll notice the back edge is completely flat. The rear hubs and backing plates are assembled next, again keeping the odd part numbers on the left side, even part numbers on the right side. Lining up the location pins, these are pressed together. While the glue dried on the rear suspension, I installed the valve covers. Make sure the mounting pins point forward on these, as these will attach to the rear bulkhead later. Moving back to the rear suspension, the drive shafts will be installed next. These were painted metallic silver, followed by a thin diluted coat of Tamiya clear orange. Next, the rear toe links are glued to the rear hub assemblies. Finally, the rear hub assemblies can be glued to the rear suspension arms. I start by aligning the rear A-arm to the bottom hole on the rear hub, and then swing it up into position, making sure the drive shaft lines up through the center of the wheel backing plate. If you have it aligned correctly, it will simply push directly into place. Once it's close, the rear toe link can be glued to the gearbox. Moving over to the left side, again I start at the bottom of the rear A-arm and line it up into the hub carrier. This then swings into position, making sure that the drive shaft falls into the center hole. Once it's lined up, it can be pushed on, and then the rear toe link can be glued in place. And finally, the rear brakes can be slid onto the hub carriers, making sure that the caliper is pointed towards the front of the car. The airbox is added next, followed by the valve cover decals. The last step is to add the rear air jack cone. It simply slots into the side of the gearbox. Like the rear suspension, the exhaust headers have even and odd part numbers depending on what side of the engine they go on. The exhaust header assembly begins by cutting off the parts from only one side of the engine at a time. Again, I'm only cutting off the parts I need to do one side of the engine. A little bit of cleanup with the hobby knife and these parts are ready to be glued together. Again, we'll use Plastruct liquid glue. Notice how the pieces fit together. There's square notches and square pegs that fit together, and round holes and round pegs that fit together. Using the liquid glue will give you a little bit of time to maneuver these into place. Next, add the final tube. It simply slots into place. A little bit more glue holds everything together. Next, we'll install the turbos to the exhaust headers. The top of the turbo should fit tightly into the air horn off of the airbox. By using liquid glue, we've got a little bit of room for adjustment here. Moving over to the right side, we'll add this turbo as well. Since the glue is still drying, the turbo's position can be slightly adjusted to make sure it's straight. Once in their proper position, you'll notice that the wastegates on the exhaust angle towards the right side of the car. I painted my headers a combination of titanium gold and then alclad steel for the darker areas. The exhaust headers can now be glued to the engine with the turbos connected to the airbox. The front suspension is installed next. Like the rear suspension, you'll notice the lower A-arms are marked for their proper location. Make sure when viewing from above you can see the two holes on the outer edge where the push rods will connect to. The radiator air ducts are glued on next, followed by the front part of the side pods. After assembling and painting the radiators and turbo air intakes, they can be glued to the monocoque. Up next is a big step, joining the front chassis section to the completed engine and gearbox. The pins on the front of the engine are aligned to the back of the rear bulkhead, and the turbos are connected to the air intakes. Make sure the engine is fully seated against the back of the bulkhead. Now it's starting to look like a race car. Jumping back to the front end of the car, we'll finish the assembly of the front suspension. Notice no glue is used where the push rods slide into the monocoque. They are only glued to the lower front A-arms. This will allow the front end to settle to the proper ride height. Here's how the front end should be looking with the push rods installed. Next I'll add the upper A-arms, again making sure to have the odd part number on the left and the even part numbered A-arm on the right. Only a tiny bit of glue is used here. Again, a quick visual check to make sure everything is lined up properly. The front hub uprights and wheel backing plates are assembled next. Make sure the holes in the hub carrier are visible through the wheel backing plate. The steering arm is slid into the monocoque, and then we can glue the hub upright to the front suspension. I start at the bottom and then swing it up into place, making sure everything lines up properly. If you're lined up correctly, these will just push right into place. The right side is assembled the same way. First the steering rod, and then the hub assembly. Almost no adjustment is needed as these fit into place so well. Next we'll install the water line hoses, starting with the short lower one first. Followed by the longer upper one. The easiest way to connect this one is to first attach it to the engine and then swing it around and connect it to the radiator. Here you can see where the two pipes attach to the engine. Next, I'll add the driver's halo and windscreen. I attach the front brake assemblies next, making sure that the caliper points to the rear of the car. The rear wing mounts were attached to the attenuator, and then I gave them a light sanding with a sanding stick to make sure they were level. Only a tiny bit of super glue was used to attach the rear wing. The undertray is assembled next. After cutting the parts loose, I gave them a light sanding with a sanding stick to remove any rough edges. Then the top two pieces can be glued in place, again using Plastric liquid glue. A couple clothespins will hold everything together nice and tight while the glue dries. The undertray was then primed with Tamiya Gray primer, followed by airbrushing it with some Tamiya Lacquer Metallic Black. Once the black had dried, now we could glue it to the completed chassis. There are a lot of mounting locations to make sure everything fits together tight and in the right places. The two are then tightly squeezed together to make sure there are no gaps and everything is mounted tight. The rear tire deflectors can be assembled next. I left these two pieces separate so I could paint the inside black and the outer part white. This is a much easier method rather than gluing them together and then having to mask and paint the black later. Next, I glued the air vents to each side pod. A little extra glue on the backside will hold these in place. Here's the two side pods with the vents firmly glued in place. Once both pieces are dry, the tire deflector can now be glued to the side pod. I'll use the car to help with the alignment while the glue dries. You may have noticed I left the exhaust tailpipes off while I was installing the headers earlier. This will allow me to put the side pod in place and then align the exhaust up through the body opening. Same method on this side. The exhaust pipes are glued to the turbo, and then the body is used as a guide to have the pipes exit through the body opening. Jumping over to the tires and wheels, the sidewalls of the tires were first wiped clean with some lacquer thinner and then given a coat of Mr. Hobby clear to give the decals something to adhere to. Once the decal is slid into place, some microset will help the decal adhere to the sidewall. The excess water is slowly brushed out from under the decal. Here you can see the sidewall decal is just about finished. All the air bubbles and wrinkles have been removed and has conformed nicely to the sidewall. Once all the tires were decaled, they were given a few light coats of Mr. Hobby matte clear coat. Like the suspension arms, the wheels were shot with Revell chrome straight from the spray can. Once everything is dry, the tires are pushed on the wheels, making sure they are fully seated. A light rub with some Tamiya weathering powder will help tone down the white decals and blend everything in together. The final step is to add the wheel nuts to each wheel, and then we can install them on the car. A little bit of Zap-A-Gap on the inside of each wheel, and then they are slid onto the axles. The glue won't dry immediately. It will give you a little time for adjustment. Same thing on the rears, some Zap-A-Gap on the inside, and then they are slid into position and adjusted to make sure everything is straight. And that's it. Our Joseph Newgarden 2023 Indy 500 winner is now complete. I hope you enjoyed this build video. I hope you'll pick up a few of these Salvino JR kits when they come out, and I hope you enjoy building it as much as I did. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll give it a like, leave me a comment on what you thought, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe.